The afternoon didn't carry any warning signs. No raised voices. No tension thick enough to notice. It was the kind of moment people forget as soon as it passes, the kind that blends into memory because it feels harmless. Cars moved slowly through the lot. A few people stood around talking, laughing too loud, killing time. Nothing about it suggested that lives were about to tilt in a new direction. She was there for a simple reason. Errands. A favor. Something small enough that no one would remember it later. Her posture was relaxed, shoulders loose, phone in hand. She wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't challenging anyone, wasn't even aware she'd drawn attention. To them, she was just another face, another stranger passing through their space. They noticed her because they were already bored. Bored people poke at the world just to feel something. One comment came first, low and meant to be funny. Another followed, louder, testing how far it could go. They watched her reaction like it was entertainment, waiting for a flinch, a blush, a reason to laugh harder. She ignored them at first. That choice annoyed them more than any insult could have. Silence doesn't give people like that what they want. It tells them they don't matter. One of them stepped closer, invading the small bubble of space people expect others to respect. The air shifted, not enough for outsiders to notice, but enough that instinct stirred. She finally spoke. Calm, firm, not angry, just enough to say stop. That word landed wrong. To them, it sounded like disrespect, like defiance, like someone forgetting their place. Egos that fragile can't stand correction, especially when it comes from someone they don't think has the right to give it. A laugh turned sharp. A face hardened. The moment stretched thin, trembling with poor decisions. The slap wasn't planned. That's what makes it worse. It came from impulse, from pride, from the belief that nothing would come of it. A hand moved before a thought could stop it. The sound was louder than expected. Skin on skin, echoing just enough to pull attention without fully drawing a crowd. For a split second, everything froze. She didn't fall. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Her head turned slightly with the force, hair shifting across her cheek, eyes blinking once as her body caught up with what had just happened. Shock passed through her like cold water, fast and numbing. The people around them reacted in fragments. Someone gasped. Someone laughed nervously, unsure if this was still a joke. Someone else looked away, already deciding not to get involved. That's how these moments survive. Not because everyone agrees with them, but because enough people choose distance over responsibility. The person who struck her felt something like triumph at first. Power, brief and intoxicating. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then uncertainty crept in. Not guilt. Not yet. Just the sudden awareness that something irreversible had occurred. She straightened slowly. Not in anger. In control. Her hand came up to her cheek, fingers brushing the spot as if memorizing it. Her eyes lifted, steady and unafraid, locking onto the face in front of her. There was no thread in her expression. No promise of retaliation. That made it worse. Words were exchanged, clumsy and defensive. Excuses disguised as jokes. Accusations flipped around to avoid responsibility. The energy had changed completely now. What felt casual minutes earlier had curdled into something heavy. She turned away, not retreating, choosing distance, choosing to leave before emotion could take the wheel. Her steps were measured, deliberate, as if she were counting each one. She pulled out her phone, thumb hovering for a second before tapping a name she'd called her entire life. On the other end, a voice answered that knew her rhythm well enough to hear the difference immediately. She didn't dramatize it, didn't cry. She stated facts the way she'd been taught. Where she was. What happened? Who did it? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. The people who had laughed earlier were already trying to rewrite the moment in their heads, convincing themselves it wasn't that bad, that it would blow over, that no one important would ever hear about it. They didn't know that a quiet afternoon had just crossed into something permanent, that a single careless action had started a chain that couldn't be stopped, that what felt like nothing in the moment would soon demand everything from them. They saw her and filled in the blanks without asking a single question. Clothes, posture, age, the way she carried herself. In their minds, she fit neatly into a story they'd already written. Someone young, someone soft, someone who would shrink if pushed hard enough. People like them rely on assumptions because assumptions save effort. They spoke to her like she was beneath explanation, like she owed them compliance. Their tone wasn't openly hostile at first, just dismissive enough to sting. The kind of casual disrespect that hides behind jokes and smirks. It's easier to insult someone when you don't believe they have teeth. What they couldn't see was the discipline behind her calm. The way she stood wasn't accidental. It was learned. Years of being taught how to hold space without asking permission. How to stay aware without looking afraid. How to listen more than you speak. None of that shows on the surface to people who only look for weakness. They mistook restraint for submission. That's a common error. When someone doesn't react right away, insecure people assume they won. They assume dominance. They lean in harder, louder, closer, chasing that feeling of control they think they've earned. Each step forward felt justified in their heads because nothing had stopped them yet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult them back. That restraint irritated them more than resistance would have. If she had yelled, they could have laughed it off. If she had cried, they would have felt powerful. Calm doesn't give bullies a script. Calm forces them to write their own, and they're rarely good at it. One of them joked about her family, about where she came from, about how no one was coming to help. It was meant to humiliate, to remind her that she was alone in that moment. The irony was sharp enough to cut, though they didn't feel it yet. They had no idea how wrong they were. Underestimating someone isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet confidence that nothing bad will happen. That belief is dangerous. It makes people sloppy. It makes them careless with words and actions. It convinces them that consequences belong to other people, in other places, at other times. She had grown up hearing stories most people only watch on screens. Stories about discipline under pressure. About keeping control when fear wants to take over. About standing your ground without announcing it. Strength, to her, wasn't about intimidation. It was about knowing exactly who you are and not needing to prove it. They saw none of that. They saw a target. The space between them felt smaller now, crowded with unspoken challenges. One of them leaned too close, breath heavy with confidence that hadn't been earned. He expected her to flinch, expected her to step back. When she didn't, irritation flashed across his face, quick and ugly. That was the moment the calculation shifted. When ego replaced reason completely. When the idea of backing down felt more threatening than escalation. He had already committed in his mind. To stop now would mean admitting he misjudged her, and that was something he couldn't allow. The others watched, feeding off the tension. Group dynamics have a way of dulling responsibility. Everyone assumes someone else will intervene, or that it's already gone too far to stop. Silence becomes permission. Laughter becomes encouragement. She spoke again, steady as before. Not pleading, not provoking, just clear. It was a boundary, plainly stated. And to someone who lives on dominance, boundaries sound like challenges. That's when the mistake fully formed. Not just the physical act that followed, but everything leading up to it. Every assumption, every dismissal, every moment they chose to believe they were dealing with someone insignificant. None of them asked her name. None of them asked who raised her. None of them considered that the calm in her eyes wasn't fear, but confidence built from knowing exactly what kind of people stood behind her, what kind of values she carried, what kind of response her call would trigger once it was made. They only understood too late that they hadn't slapped a stranger. They had crossed a line drawn long before that day. A line protected by people who didn't bluff, people who didn't posture, people who took disrespect personally and permanently, people who believed that actions deserved answers, and that answers were never gentle. The moment itself was smaller than anyone would expect. No dramatic build-up, no slow motion, just a sudden shift in the air, like a storm snapping into place without warning. 1 second there were words, sharp and careless. The next there was movement that couldn't be taken back. His hand came up fast, driven by impulse more than intent. He didn't think about cameras, witnesses, or consequences. He thought about control, about saving face, about proving something to the people standing behind him. Violence, in moments like that, feels simple to the person committing it. A shortcut, an exclamation point at the end of an argument they don't know how to finish. The sound cut through everything. A flat, unmistakable crack that made nearby conversation stumble. It wasn't loud enough to stop the world, but it was loud enough to mark it. People heard it and knew, instantly, that something had crossed from uncomfortable into unacceptable. Her head turned slightly with the force, hair sweeping across her cheek. For a fraction of a second, her body reacted before her mind did. Muscles tightened, breath caught, vision narrowed, pain bloomed hot and sudden, then settled into a deep, throbbing awareness. Shock came next. Not the dramatic kind people expect, but the quiet, hollow pause where time stretches thin. The brain trying to make sense of what just happened. The disbelief that someone actually went there. That a line everyone pretends not to see was just bulldozed through without hesitation. The people around them reacted unevenly. One person stepped back. Another froze. Someone laughed, too loud and too late, trying to pretend it was still just rough talk. No one moved to help her. No one stepped in front of her. Fear and discomfort kept them rooted where they were. The man who struck her felt the rush fade almost immediately. Power has a short shelf life when it's stolen like that. What replaced it was confusion, a tightening in his chest. A flicker of doubt he shoved down fast. He squared his shoulders, trying to look unbothered, already preparing excuses he hoped he wouldn't need. She stood still. That was what unsettled him most. No yelling, no collapse, no performance, just stillness, deliberate and controlled. Her eyes lifted slowly, meeting his without flinching. There was pain there, but no panic, no submission. That look landed heavier than any punch could have. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was recognition, as if she had just seen him clearly for the first time and found him lacking. That kind of judgment doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Her hand came up, fingers brushing her cheek with careful pressure. She tested the tenderness, the heat under her skin. It grounded her, anchored her back into herself. She breathed in through her nose, steady and deep, the way she'd been taught to do when adrenaline surged. Words followed, messy and defensive. He said she provoked him. Someone else chimed in, backing him up without conviction. Another voice suggested they all just forget it happened. The scramble to rewrite reality began immediately, each person grabbing for a version that made them less responsible. She didn't argue. She didn't correct them. She didn't need their version of events. She turned slightly, creating space, putting physical distance between herself and the man who had just made the worst decision of his day. That movement alone shifted the balance. Control reclaimed quietly. Her phone was already in her hand. Not shaking, not rushed, just precise. She unlocked it with a familiar motion, scrolled once, and stopped. The name on the screen wasn't decorative. It carried weight. History. Expectation. Around her, the atmosphere thickened. People sensed the shift without understanding it. Something about the way she moved, the way she held herself now, hinted that the moment hadn't ended with the slap, that it had only just begun. The man noticed it too. The confidence he'd worn like armor earlier felt thin now. He watched her from the corner of his eye, trying to read her expression, trying to guess what came next. He told himself it was nothing, that she was bluffing, that no one important would care. She raised the phone to her ear and waited. One ring. Two. Her gaze never left the group as the call connected. She didn't need to explain much. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. The kind of silence that listens carefully, stores details, and prepares responses. The slap had been quick, almost forgettable in its execution. But it wasn't just a strike. It was a statement, an assertion of dominance that backfired the second it landed. A physical line crossed that turned an ordinary conflict into something far more serious. In that brief contact, he hadn't just hurt her. He had revealed himself. He had shown exactly how he handled resistance, how little control he actually had, how easily his ego overrode his judgment. He had placed his actions into a category that demanded answers, not apologies, and those answers were already on their way. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in through cracks they hadn't bothered to seal. At first, they talked over each other, voices overlapping as they tried to decide what version of the story would stick. Each sentence was a test balloon, floated to see who would agree, who would nod, who would stay quiet. He said she mouthed off. Someone else said she got too close. Another claimed it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The story shifted with every retelling, details added and removed depending on who was listening. Lies do that. They're flexible until they collapse. She stayed quiet while they talked, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she didn't need to compete. She already knew the truth didn't need volume. It just needed time. People who lie rush. People who tell the truth wait. A few bystanders had pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages while their cameras stayed angled just enough to catch faces, voices, fragments of the moment. No one announced it. No one needed to. In a world like this, memory isn't trusted. Proof is, the man who had struck her started to feel the shift. He could sense attention drifting away from his words. The confidence he tried to project didn't land the way it had earlier. His tone grew sharper, then more defensive. He repeated himself, a sure sign he wasn't convincing anyone anymore. Questions began to surface, quietly at first, from people who hadn't been involved but had seen enough to be uneasy. Why did it escalate that fast? Why did he touch her at all? Why was everyone so eager to explain instead of listening? Someone asked her if she was okay. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a simple question, offered without expectation. She nodded once. That was all. But that small acknowledgement shifted sympathy in a way no argument could. The group dynamic cracked. One of the people who had laughed earlier stopped laughing. Another took a step back, creating distance from the man at the center of it all. When responsibility starts to look real, people instinctively reposition themselves. He noticed. Panic crept in, subtle but undeniable. He tried to reclaim control by talking faster, louder, layering justification on top of justification. The problem was that each explanation contradicted the last. The truth, simple and unchanging, stood in stark contrast. She finally spoke again, her voice level, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. She didn't insult him. She didn't accuse. She stated exactly what happened, in order, without embellishment. Time, words, action, impact. That was it. There was no room in her account for interpretation. No emotional spikes. No dramatic pauses. Just facts. People trust facts when they're delivered without agenda. Silence followed. Not awkward, not confused. Heavy. The kind of silence that settles when people realize they've been standing on the wrong side of something and don't know how to move without being noticed. The man opened his mouth to interrupt, then stopped. For the first time since it began, he hesitated. He could feel the ground slipping. Every excuse he'd prepared suddenly sounded thin, even to himself. He glanced around, searching for support, and found eyes avoiding his. Someone else spoke up, confirming what she said. Then another. Small details aligned. The timing. The words used. The moment it escalated. Truth has a way of snapping into focus when enough pieces match. He shifted tactics. Apologies started to surface, clumsy and conditional. He didn't say he was wrong. He said things got out of hand. He didn't take responsibility. He suggested everyone calm down. The language of someone trying to minimize what could no longer be minimized. She didn't respond to the apology. She didn't need it. Apologies offered under pressure aren't about remorse. They're about escape. The realization spread unevenly but decisively. This wasn't going away. This wasn't something that could be laughed off or blamed on misunderstanding. Too many people had seen too much. Too many details had lined up. The truth moved faster than the excuses because it didn't have to be managed. It didn't need coordination. It didn't need agreement. It just existed, solid and immovable, while the lies tripped over each other trying to keep up. Phones stayed raised a little longer. Names were asked. Descriptions exchanged. Someone mentioned calling it in, their voice casual but firm. The word consequences hung in the air without being spoken. The man's posture changed. Shoulders that had been squared earlier slumped slightly. His eyes darted again, not looking for dominance now, but for exits, for ways out of a situation that had grown teeth. She stood where she was, centered, composed, watching the truth do what it always does when given space. It stripped away bravado. It dismantled stories built on convenience. It left only what actually happened, bare and unavoidable. The shift in power wasn't announced. It didn't come with raised voices or sudden movement. It happened quietly, in the way the air changed around them, in the way people adjusted where they stood and who they stood near. Confidence that had once filled the space began to leak out, replaced by something tighter and far less comfortable. Earlier, they had taken up room without thinking. Arms loose, chests out, laughing too loudly. Now their movements were smaller, shoulders angled inward, hands tucked into pockets. They were no longer performing for each other. They were watching, listening, calculating. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Often it looks like restraint, like someone choosing their words more carefully than they did before, like eyes that won't settle, scanning for reactions, for approval that no longer comes. The same people who had fed off each other's bravado were now careful not to stand too close to the man at the center of it all. He felt it before he understood it. The loss of control, the way the group no longer mirrored his energy. When he spoke, no one laughed. When he gestured, no one leaned in. The feedback loop that had fueled him earlier had gone silent. Authority had shifted without anyone stepping forward to claim it. It settled instead around her. Not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. She didn't pace. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice to be heard. She stood still, grounded, letting everyone else reveal themselves. The people watching sensed it too. The way attention gravitated toward her without effort. When she spoke, others stopped talking. When she paused, they waited. Power, real power, doesn't scramble. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to prove anything. Fear sharpened the man's awareness. He replayed the moment in his head, over and over, looking for a version where he came out on top. Each replay ended the same way. The sound of the slap, the way it echoed, the way her expression didn't break, the way everything after had spiraled beyond his reach. He tried to assert himself again, straightening up, lifting his chin, forcing his voice to sound steady. It came out brittle, too rehearsed, too late. The people who might have backed him earlier were already distancing themselves, both physically and emotionally. One of them murmured something about not wanting trouble. Another mentioned cameras, pointing vaguely toward the building. Someone else checked their phone again, not pretending this time. The reality of accountability crept in from all sides. Fear makes people honest in unexpected ways. It strips away the unnecessary noise and leaves only survival. The man stopped posturing. He stopped explaining. He started asking questions instead. What was going to happen? Who had been called? How serious this was? Each question gave away more than he realized. They weren't the questions of someone in control. They were the questions of someone reacting. She watched him with the same steady focus she'd maintained since it happened. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No anger either. Just assessment. Like someone measuring a situation accurately and deciding what mattered. The power imbalance widened. Where he had once loomed, he now shrank. Not physically, but socially, emotionally. His presence no longer dominated the space. It disrupted it. People shifted away from him instinctively, unwilling to be associated with the fallout. Even his friends began to hedge. One corrected a detail he got wrong. Another reminded him to calm down. Their loyalty thinned under pressure, fraying at the edges. Fear has a way of clarifying priorities, and self-preservation usually wins. She didn't need to threaten him. She didn't need to raise a hand or a voice. The consequences were already unfolding around him, visible in the way his breathing changed, in the way his jaw tightened when he realized he couldn't talk his way out of this. Authority now came from certainty, not volume. From composure, not force. She had it. He didn't. The people nearby mirrored that understanding. They deferred to her without being told. They looked to her when decisions were made about what came next. When someone suggested calling someone else, eyes flicked to her for confirmation. Fear settled into his posture fully now. It bent his shoulders. It crept into his tone. He started choosing words that sounded smaller, softer, less absolute. Gone was the man who thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. In his place stood someone realizing that power borrowed from intimidation evaporates the moment it's challenged by reality, that dominance built on fear collapses when fear changes sides, that the room no longer belonged to him, and it never really had in the first place. Begging doesn't start with words. It starts with posture, with the way someone who once stood tall begins to fold in on themselves without realizing it. Knees bend slightly, shoulders slope forward. The chest caves just enough to signal surrender before the mouth ever opens. At first, he tried to negotiate without admitting fear. His voice dropped, the sharp edges smoothed out. He spoke slower, choosing phrases meant to sound reasonable. He said things like, "Let's all calm down, like adults. Like this could still be reset if everyone agreed to pretend it hadn't happened." No one moved. Silence pressed in around him, heavier now than it had been at any point before. The kind of silence that waits, that listens, that doesn't rush to save anyone. His eyes flicked to her again, searching for something he could use. Anger, emotion, anything that might give him leverage. He found none. She stood exactly as she had, hands relaxed, face composed, attention fixed on him with a clarity that made his skin prickle. The realization settled unevenly. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about damage control. His words started to tangle. Apologies surfaced again, more direct this time, stripped of their earlier excuses. He said he didn't mean it. He said he lost his temper. He said it wasn't who he really was. Each sentence came faster than the last, urgency bleeding through despite his effort to contain it. Someone nearby shifted uncomfortably. Another person cleared their throat. No one stepped in to help him. No one vouched for his character. The absence of support spoke louder than any accusation. Fear finally cracked through his voice. It wasn't dramatic, just enough of a tremor to betray him. He asked what she wanted. The question hung there, exposed. It assumed she now held something over him, something to be bargained with. She didn't answer right away. That pause unraveled him more than any threat could have. In the space where her response should have been, his imagination filled in possibilities he couldn't control, consequences he couldn't predict, people he couldn't outrun. He swallowed hard. His hands came together unconsciously, fingers lacing and unlacing. A physical tell he couldn't suppress. The man who had once used his body to intimidate now used it to plead without words. He tried again, softer still. He said, "Please." It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was small, reduced. The sound of someone realizing the floor beneath them was gone, and there was nothing left to grab. The group watched, some with discomfort, some with quiet judgment. A few avoided looking at him altogether. Watching someone fall that far forces reflection, and not everyone wants to see how close they might be to doing the same. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, uncertain where to stand, where to put himself now that dominance was no longer an option. His earlier confidence felt like a different lifetime, something reckless and stupid that had belonged to someone else. He started promising things. He'd leave. He'd never come back. He'd make it right. Each promise stacked on the last, growing more desperate, less believable. Promises made under fear rarely carry weight. She finally spoke, and when she did, it wasn't what he expected. No shouting, no demands, just a few words, calm and measured, cutting through the noise like a blade through fabric. Enough to make it clear that this wasn't a negotiation, that it had never been. That clarity broke him. His knees bent further now, not all the way to the ground, but close enough that the intent was unmistakable. His head dipped. His gaze dropped. The posture of someone stripped of options. The people around them felt it collectively. The shift from confrontation to collapse. From arrogance to humiliation. It was uncomfortable to witness because it was real. He nodded repeatedly as she spoke, agreeing before she finished, desperate to show compliance. The man who had demanded respect earlier now offered it freely, carelessly, hoping it would buy him mercy. But mercy wasn't hers to give in the way he meant it. And he knew that. That was the worst part. The begging continued, quieter now, almost automatic. A reflex more than a strategy. His voice cracked again, and this time he didn't try to hide it. He was past pride, past saving face, past pretending he was in control. What remained was a man kneeling in everything but name, facing the consequences of a single violent moment, understanding too late that strength isn't measured by who you can overpower, but by who you never needed to hurt in the first place, and that once fear changes sides, it doesn't come back willingly.